Today, we're going to learn about Flask. It's a lightweight web server written in Python, and it's a really great way to get small projects off the ground very quickly. To learn about Flask, we're going to make a few simple routes and use those routes to interact with an in-memory data store. In later videos, we'll talk about more advanced Flask usage, such as how to handle files and how to interact with databases. Before we get into Flask, let's remind ourselves of the common HTTP methods that are used to standardize everything that happens on the internet. So first we start off with get. Get is the equivalent of a read if we're talking about a CRUD operation. The next operation is post. Post is the equivalent of a create. It allows you to create new things. Patch is a verb that allows you to update a resource. And finally, delete, as the name would imply, allows you to delete or remove a resource. Our project is going to require a little more setup than normal. We're going to need to set up a virtual environment. We'll need to install some requirements, and then we can get to building our code. Once we're ready to run our code, it's going to run a little bit different than normal. Instead of calling Python, we're going to call our application within the Flask app itself. As we've covered in other videos, setting up a virtual environment is a two-step process. First, you create the environment, and then you activate it. Our exercise today is going to have a single requirement, Flask. So what we're going to do is add Flask to a requirements.txt file, and then use pip to install those requirements within our virtual environment. Our initial code is going to focus on getting the right imports in place. Once we have the right imports, we'll construct a Flask object, we'll create a route, and we'll save the file to a specific name so it can be picked up by default by Flask. Our code is going to run within Flask itself. Remember, a web server continually sits there and it looks for new connections. In this case, Flask is going to help make the connection to our code so each of our routes can handle the incoming traffic. To test endpoints on our server, we'll use a tool named Postman. Now, Postman isn't sponsoring this video. It just happens to be a common tool that's used in the industry, and it's one that I've found very useful when I've been testing different services. There are also other tools out there you can use, but the main idea is we want something that allows us to quickly put together requests, save those requests, and be able to come back and use them later. In other videos, we'll go into more advanced features that you can do with Postman too. Our first endpoint we're going to create is going to be a post endpoint. This post endpoint is going to allow us to create a student. All of our objects today will be related to operations for a student resource. When we're going through and creating this student resource, we're going to define a route that's going to allow an address to be reached through post. We're going to validate the request body, actually create the resource, persist it to storage, and then once everything is saved to storage, we're going to go ahead and return an HTTP 201 response created to signify that the information has been created on the server. Now that we have a way to create student resources, we need a way to read them back. So we're going to implement our first endpoint that it's going to read, and this read is going to be able to return a collection of all students that have been entered in the system so far. Well, this is great, but what if we want just one student? Well, we can do that too, and we'll also do it through the get method. The address for this particular method is going to be a little bit different. It's going to have a resource ID within the address, which is going to allow us to look it up within our storage. Now, because we're looking up something, that thing that's being requested might not exist. So as the request comes in, we need to make sure that the thing that's being requested is actually there. And once it's actually there, we can return it to the caller and provide the information about the resource. An API that lets you write items and read them back is useful, but it's even more useful when we can apply updates to resources. So in this part, we're going to go through how to do an update, and we'll do that through the patch verb. Patch is going to look very similar to the creation process, but instead of creating an item, we're going to work on an existing item in our storage, do the updates, and then return the updated item. Our final operation we'll go through is how to delete a resource. So we'll use the delete verb for that. And similar to how when we were reading a student, we can only delete something if it exists. So we'll check and see if it exists. If it does exist, we'll go ahead and delete it. Now the difference with a deleted response is once you've deleted it, it doesn't exist anymore. So there's really no content to return. And so we will reflect that with the HTTP 204 response.